A biting wind howls across the plains, a prelude to the blinding white fury of the Great Blizzard of 1886. In a desolate cabin, a lone woman, Abigail, cradles her newborn twins. Her husband, taken by a fever just weeks before, lies buried beneath the frost-hardened earth. Now abandoned, and with her supplies dwindling, she faces a new, more terrifying threat. The fire sputters the last of her firewood, turning to ash. As the storm rages, a chilling silence descends, broken only by the hungry cries of her infants. Hope is a dying ember, until a shadow falls across her snow-choked doorway. The silence was the first thing that truly terrified Abigail. It wasn't the gentle quiet of a prairie evening filled with the hum of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. This was a dead silence, a heavy blanket pressed down upon the world by the sheer weight of the snow. The relentless, shrieking wind that had battered their small cabin for 2 days had finally ceased, leaving an unnerving stillness in its wake. Outside, the world had vanished, replaced by a churning white abyss. Abigail shifted the rough wool of her late husband's coat, scratching against her raw skin. In the cradle he had carved with his own hands, her twin boys, Caleb and Joshua, slept a fitful, shallow sleep. They were a month old, born into a world that had immediately shown them its harshest face. Their father, Jedediah, had seen them only once, his eyes alight with fever, shining with a desperate joy, before the sickness stole him away. He was buried on the small rise behind the cabin, his grave now lost beneath a 6-foot drift. The Great Blizzard of 1886, they would later call it. For Abigail, it was simply the end of everything. They had come to the Texas Panhandle with dreams as vast as the sky, their wagon filled with hope and sturdy tools. They had built this one-room cabin with their own hands, every log, a testament to their shared future. Now the future was a terrifying blank canvas, as white and featureless as the landscape outside her window. Her gaze fell upon the hearth. The fire, her only source of warmth, was a pathetic collection of glowing embers. The last of the firewood had been consumed hours ago. She had burned the spare chair, then the small bookshelf Jedediah had built. Her eyes strayed to the cradle, and she recoiled in horror at the thought. No, never the cradle. The cold was a physical presence in the room, a predator stalking the edges of the dying fire's light. It seeped through the chinks in the log walls, a constant, insidious reminder of their vulnerability. Abigail pulled the thin blankets tighter around her shoulders, her own shivering a counter-rhythm to the soft, whimpering breaths of her sons. Hunger was a dull ache in her belly, but it was the baby's hunger that twisted her insides. Her milk was failing her body, too starved and stressed to produce enough for 2. Their cries had weakened over the past day, a sound that terrified her more than any shriek of the wind. A weak cry meant a weak child. She had to do something. She couldn't simply sit here and wait for death to claim them. Jedediah had been a good man, a strong man, but he had not anticipated a blizzard of this magnitude. Their supplies were meant to last until the spring thaw, but the unseasonable cold had come early, and with a vengeance. The last of the salted pork was gone. The flour sack was a dusty memory, and the few remaining potatoes were frozen solid in their bin. Abigail's eyes scanned the small cabin, searching for anything at all that could be used. Her gaze landed on a small leather-bound pouch hanging from a nail on the wall. Jedediah's possibles bag. He had been a meticulous man, and his possibles bag was always filled with the small essential items a man might need on the trail. Flint and steel, a small knife, a twist of tobacco, and she prayed a few strips of jerky. With trembling fingers, she took the bag down. Her hands were numb with cold, and it took her several fumbling attempts to untie the leather thong. Inside she found the familiar items, the scent of her husband's tobacco, filling her with a fresh wave of grief. And there at the bottom, wrapped in a small piece of oilcloth, were 3 strips of dried venison. Tears welled in her eyes, hot against her frozen cheeks. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was hope. She gnawed on a small piece, the tough, salty meat, a shock to her empty stomach. She saved the rest, knowing it would have to last. But the fire was the most critical thing. Without it, the cold would claim them before the hunger. She looked around the cabin again, her eyes now desperate. The bedstead, the floorboards, the very walls of their home. Her gaze fell upon Jedediah's trunk at the foot of the bed. It contained his spare clothes, his books, his letters from his family back east. It was all she had left of him, tangible memories of the man she had loved. To burn them would be a desecration, a final brutal severing of her connection to him. Caleb let out a thin, reedy cry, and Joshua stirred in response. Their small faces were pale, their lips tinged with blue. The choice was no choice at all. With a heavy heart, she knelt before the trunk. Her tears fell onto the cold wood as she lifted the lid. She started with his books, feeding them to the embers one by one. The words of poets and philosophers turning to black ash. Then came the letters, their ink-filled pages curling and blackening in the heat. It felt like she was burning her own heart. But the small fire that resulted was a blessing. It pushed back the encroaching cold, and for a little while the cabin felt almost safe. She huddled by the hearth, the babies in their cradle pulled as close as she dared. She watched the flames devour her husband's memory, and she prayed. She prayed for a miracle. She prayed for the sun. She prayed for a sound other than the whimpering of her children and the mournful sigh of the wind as it began to pick up once more. Miles away, a lone figure moved through the white hellscape. He was Nokona, a warrior of the Quahadi Comanche. He was a man in his late 20s, his face a mask of hardened resilience, his eyes the color of obsidian, missing nothing. He moved with a lithe, predatory grace, his snowshoes distributing his weight as he navigated the treacherous drifts. He was not lost. A Comanche was never lost in his own land. He was between. His band was wintering in the Palo Duro Canyon, a 2-day ride to the south in good weather. But this was not good weather. He had been on a solo hunt, seeking the last of the season's buffalo, when the blizzard had descended with a speed and ferocity he had never before witnessed. He had been tracking a small herd for days, his skill and patience a legacy of generations of hunters. He had been close, so close, when the sky had turned a leaden gray and the first flakes had begun to fall. He had known then that the hunt was over. Survival was now the only quarry. He had found shelter in a small cave. His Mustang, a sturdy, intelligent animal, huddled with him against the cold. For 2 days he had waited out the worst of the storm, his rations of dried meat and parched corn sustaining him. But the blizzard had not broken, and he knew he could not stay in the cave forever. His horse needed to graze, and his own supplies were running low. When the wind had died down to a low moan, he had known it was time to move. He was heading south towards the canyon, but the journey was perilous. The snow had reshaped the land, hiding familiar landmarks and creating new treacherous obstacles. He moved slowly, his senses on high alert. his spear clutched in his gloved hand. He was not a man given to introspection, but the vast white silence of the plains gave him pause. He thought of his wife and their young son, safe in the winter camp. He thought of the ever-shrinking herds of buffalo, their numbers decimated by the white hunters with their powerful rifles. He thought of the settlers, the Tejanos, who were carving up the land with their fences and their plows, changing the very face of the earth. He felt a deep, abiding anger towards them, an anger born of loss and a sense of profound injustice. They had taken so much, and they were still taking. They did not understand the land did not respect it. They saw it as something to be conquered, to be tamed. For Nokona, the land was a living thing, a mother who provided for her children, and the settlers were wounding her grievously. He topped a small rise and paused, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. The world was a sea of white, broken only by the skeletal remains of a few hardy mesquite trees. And then he saw it. A thin, almost imperceptible wisp of smoke rising into the still air. His first instinct was suspicion. It could be other hunters, perhaps, from a rival tribe. It could be soldiers, or it could be settlers. He approached with caution, his movements silent and fluid. The smoke was coming from a small cabin almost completely buried in the snow. It was a crude structure, the kind the settlers threw up in their haste to claim a piece of land that was not theirs. He circled the cabin, his eyes taking in every detail. There were no tracks other than the ones he was now making. No sign of horses or cattle. The only indication of life was the thin plume of smoke, and that was beginning to fade. He crept closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He could easily bypass the cabin, continue on his journey south. The settlers were not his concern. And yet, there was something about the utter stillness of the place that troubled him. It was the same dead silence that had unnerved Abigail, a silence that spoke of desperation and dwindling hope. He reached the single window, its glass caked with frost. He used the edge of his knife to scrape away a small patch. He peered inside. The light was dim, the fire in the hearth, little more than a pile of glowing embers. And then he saw her. A woman, her face pale, and drawn her eyes wide, with a fear that transcended the immediate threat of the storm. She was huddled on the floor, her arms wrapped around a small bundle. And in a cradle near the hearth, he saw another identical bundle. Twins. His breath caught in his throat. He had a son of his own, a small, curious boy, who was the center of his world. He knew the fierce, protective love a parent felt for their child, and he saw that same love in the eyes of this white woman, a love that was universal, that transcended the boundaries of tribe and race. He saw her desperation, her utter isolation. He saw the dying fire, the bare cupboards, the look of a woman who had resigned herself to death, but who would fight for her children with her last breath. His anger, the cold, hard anger he had felt towards the settlers, began to melt away, replaced by something else, something he could not immediately name. It was not pity. It was a sense of shared humanity, a recognition of a fellow soul in extremis. He could still turn away. He could leave them to their fate. It was the law of the prairie, the harsh, unforgiving law of survival. But as he looked at the woman and her two small, helpless children, he knew he could not. His path had brought him here for a reason. He stood up, the decision made. He took a deep breath, the frigid air burning his lungs, and then he raised his hand and knocked on the door of the cabin. The sound of the knock was so unexpected that Abigail thought she had imagined it. It was a sharp, solid sound, a sound that did not belong in her world of wind and snow and dying embers. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Caleb whimpered in his sleep, and the sound broke her paralysis. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and a wild, desperate hope. Who could possibly be out there? A neighbor, a lost traveler, or something far more dangerous? The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Abigail grabbed the only weapon she had, a heavy iron poker from the hearth. She crept to the door, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold iron. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice a hoarse whisper. There was no answer, only the soft crunch of snow outside the door. Abigail's mind raced. It could be anyone. A band of outlaws driven by the storm to seek shelter. Or worse, she had heard stories. Terrifying stories, whispered around campfires of Comanche raids of settlers, taken captive, their fates too horrible to contemplate. She pressed her ear to the door, but she could hear nothing over the frantic beating of her own heart. She had to know who was out there. She couldn't let them freeze to death, not if there was a chance they were friendly, but she couldn't risk the lives of her children by opening the door to a potential threat. "I have a rifle," she lied, her voice trembling, "and I'm not afraid to use it. State your business." Again, there was silence. And then a voice, low and calm, spoke in a language she did not understand. It was not Spanish, the language of the Tejanos. It was something else, something guttural and ancient. Comanche. A wave of pure terror washed over Abigail. Every horror story she had ever heard flooded her mind. She was alone, a defenseless woman with 2 infants. They would be shown no mercy. But the voice, it was not angry or threatening. It was calm, measured. And there was only one voice. Not a war party. A lone man. She was still clutching the poker, her body tense, when a small piece of wood was pushed under the door. It was a piece of dried mesquite, a symbol of peace. And then another object slid under the door. A small, intricately carved wooden bird. A child's toy. Abigail stared at the small bird, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. This was not the act of a savage bent on destruction. This was something else entirely. She looked at her sons, their small faces peaceful in sleep. She looked at the dying fire, at the empty cupboards. She was going to die. They were all going to die. If she did nothing, their fate was sealed. The man outside this lone Comanche was an unknown, but he was her only chance. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she unlatched the door. It swung open on frozen hinges, revealing the man standing on her doorstep. He was tall and lean, wrapped in buffalo hides against the cold. His face was stern, his black eyes missing nothing. He held no weapon in his hands, but she did not doubt for a moment that he was dangerous. He was a predator, a man of the wilderness, and she was a lamb in his path. They stood there for a long moment, 2 people from different worlds, their lives colliding in the midst of a blizzard. Abigail's terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered with a flicker of something else. Curiosity. And a desperate, irrational hope. Nokona's gaze swept over her, then moved to the cradle by the hearth. He saw the 2 small bundles, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He said something in his own language, his voice still calm and low. Abigail shook her head, clutching the poker tighter. "I don't understand." He pointed to the fire, then to the woodpile outside, which was buried under a deep drift of snow. He then pointed to his own chest and said one word, a word that needed no translation. Nokona. He then gestured to the empty cupboards, his meaning clear. He understood their plight. He knew they were starving, freezing. He took a step back away from the door, and then turned and walked towards the snow-covered woodpile. Abigail watched her heart in her throat as he began to dig with his bare hands, the snow flying as he worked with a speed and efficiency that was breathtaking. Within minutes, he had uncovered a small stack of logs. He carried them to the door, his movements economical and precise. He did not enter the cabin. He simply left the wood on the doorstep, then turned and disappeared into the swirling snow. Abigail was stunned into inaction. She stared at the wood, then at the empty space where the Comanche had stood. Had she imagined it? Was he an angel, a spirit of the prairie sent to save them? But the wood was real, and the cold was real, and the cries of her hungry children were real. She quickly dragged the logs inside her heart, soaring with a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She fed the fire, and as the flames leaped up, chasing the shadows from the corners of the room, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the burning wood. It was the warmth of hope rekindled. An hour later, Nokona returned. This time, he brought a rabbit, its fur still warm, and a handful of wild onions he had dug from beneath the snow. He left them on the doorstep, just as he had with the wood, and then vanished once more. Abigail skinned the rabbit with trembling hands, her stomach rumbling with a hunger so fierce it was painful. She made a simple stew, the aroma filling the small cabin with a scent so heavenly it made her dizzy. She fed her sons a thin, watered-down broth, and they drank it greedily, their small bodies seeming to gain strength with every spoonful. This strange, silent alliance continued for the next 2 days. Nokona would appear at her door with food, another rabbit, a brace of prairie chickens, a handful of dried berries he had found in a sheltered thicket. He never spoke, never tried to enter the cabin. He was a ghost, a silent provider, his presence a constant source of both comfort and unease for Abigail. She began to lose her fear of him. She still clutched the poker whenever she heard the crunch of his snowshoes outside her door, but it was now more out of habit than genuine terror. She found herself watching for him, her heart lifting at the sight of his tall, solitary figure emerging from the white wilderness. She learned his rhythms, the times of day he was most likely to appear. She would leave a small bowl of stew on the doorstep for him, a silent offering of thanks. He never acknowledged it, but the bowl was always empty when she retrieved it later. On the 3rd day, the blizzard broke. The sun, a pale, watery disk, appeared in the sky, its light glinting off the vast, unbroken expanse of snow. The world was transformed, a dazzling, beautiful landscape that belied the terror of the past few days. Nokona appeared at her door that morning, as he always did. But this time, he did not leave. He stood there, his obsidian eyes fixed on her, and he spoke. "The snow is deep," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "You cannot stay here." Abigail was so surprised to hear him speak English that she could only stare at him speechless. "My people are 2 days' journey from here," he continued. "You will come with me." Abigail's old fears resurfaced. To go with him, to the Comanche camp. It was unthinkable. The stories she had heard. I can't," she stammered. "My boys. They're too small. The journey would kill them." "They will die if you stay here," he said, his voice flat and uncompromising. "The coyotes and the wolves will come. They will smell your fear." He was right, she knew. The thaw would bring new dangers. The predators of the plains, starved by the storm, would be on the hunt. She was still weak, her supplies gone. She could not defend herself and her children against a pack of hungry wolves. She looked at Nokona, at his strong, impassive face. He had saved them. He had shown them kindness when he could have left them to die. Could she trust him? Did she have a choice? "I will not harm you or your children," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "I swear it on the spirits of my ancestors." Abigail looked at her sons sleeping peacefully in their cradle, their cheeks now tinged with a healthy pink. She looked at the man before her, the Comanche warrior who had appeared out of the blizzard like a phantom. Her life and the lives of her children were in his hands. "I will come with you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But if you harm my children, I will kill you." A faint smile touched Nokona's lips. "A prairie woman's heart is as strong as a buffalo's," he said. "It is good." And so began the next even more improbable chapter of their story. The widowed settler and the Comanche hunter, their two worlds colliding their fates now intertwined, set off together into the vast white wilderness of the Texas Panhandle. The journey would be long and arduous, and new dangers awaited them. But for now, they were alive, and they were together. The journey south was a trial of endurance. Nokona, with a stoicism that both awed and unnerved Abigail, seemed immune to the biting cold and the arduous task of breaking a trail through the waist-deep snow. He fashioned a makeshift travois, from sapling branches a small, sturdy sled, on which he secured the cradle containing Caleb and Joshua. He wrapped the infants in every spare blanket and hide Abigail possessed, creating a warm, snug cocoon for them. Abigail, weak from her ordeal and unaccustomed to such physical exertion, struggled to keep up. The snowshoes Nokona had made for her were a clumsy, alien encumbrance on her feet, and she fell more times than she could count. Each time he would stop his face impassive and wait for her to pick herself up. He never offered a hand, but he never left her behind. They traveled in silence for the most part. The world was a vast white canvas, and their small party was a tiny speck of life in its midst. At night, Nokona would build a fire in a sheltered spot, the flames a welcome beacon in the frigid darkness. He would share his meager rations of dried meat and corn, and Abigail would nurse her sons, her milk now flowing more freely thanks to the food he had provided. She watched him, this strange, silent man who had saved her. He moved with a quiet confidence, his every action purposeful and efficient. He was a part of this harsh, unforgiving landscape as much as the wind and the snow. And she was an intruder, a trespasser in a world she did not understand. On the second night, as they huddled by the fire, the silence between them was broken by the distant howl of a wolf. It was a long, mournful sound that sent a shiver down Abigail's spine. The howl was answered by another, then another, until the night was filled with their eerie chorus. Abigail pulled her sons closer, her heart pounding. The wolves were close, too close. Nokona was on his feet in an instant, his spear in his hand. He scanned the darkness, his body tense, his eyes narrowed. He threw more wood on the fire, the flames leaping up, casting dancing shadows on the snow. "Stay by the fire," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Do not move." He disappeared into the darkness, and Abigail was alone with her terror. The howling grew louder, closer. She could hear the crunch of their paws on the snow, could see their shadowy forms flitting at the edges of the firelight. She clutched the iron poker, her only weapon, but she knew it would be useless against a pack of hungry wolves. She closed her eyes and prayed her prayers, a desperate litany of fear and hope. And then she heard it, a sound that chilled her to the bone, a sound more terrifying than the howling of the wolves, a high-pitched, ululating cry, a sound that spoke of violence and death, a Comanche war cry. She opened her eyes to see Nokona, a whirlwind of motion, a dervish of death in the firelight. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking, his spear a blur of motion, his knife a glint of deadly steel. The wolves, starved and bold, were no match for him. He was a warrior in his element, a predator at the top of the food chain. The fight was over in minutes. The surviving wolves fled into the darkness, their howls now whimpers of pain and fear. Nokona stood in the firelight, his chest heaving, his body spattered with blood. He was no longer the silent, stoic provider. He was a killer, a savage, a man capable of a brutality that terrified her. He turned to look at her, his eyes burning with a fierce, primal light. And in that moment, Abigail's fear of him, the fear she had suppressed, the fear she had tried to reason away, came rushing back, a tidal wave of terror that threatened to drown her. He had saved her from the wolves, but who would save her from him? The rest of the journey was a blur of fear and exhaustion for Abigail. She avoided Nokona's gaze, flinching whenever he came near. He seemed to sense her fear, and he kept his distance, his silence now a heavy, oppressive weight between them. On the fourth day, they reached the edge of the Palo Duro Canyon. The sight was breathtaking. The vast flat plain of the Llano Estacado simply fell away, revealing a network of canyons and mesas, a hidden world of color and life in the midst of the winter landscape. Nokona led them down a narrow, winding trail, his Mustang, which he had retrieved from its hiding place, navigating the steep descent with an easy grace. As they descended into the canyon, the air grew warmer, the snow thinner. They passed groves of juniper and cottonwood, their branches bare against the blue sky. And then she saw it, the Comanche camp. It was a large encampment with dozens of teepees nestled in a sheltered valley by a frozen river. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. The sounds of children playing, of women, talking, of horses neighing. This was Nokona's world, and she was an alien, an intruder. As they entered the camp, a hush fell over the people. All eyes turned to them, to the tall warrior and the white woman with her 2 infants. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and open hostility. Nokona led her to a large teepee in the center of the camp. An old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes as black and sharp as Nokona's, emerged from the teepee. She looked at Abigail, then at the babies, and then she spoke to Nokona in their own language, her voice sharp and questioning. Nokona answered her in a low, calm voice, his gaze steady. The old woman listened, her expression unreadable. And then she did something that surprised Abigail. She reached out and touched Caleb's cheek, her gnarled finger surprisingly gentle. A faint smile touched her lips. The old woman was Nokona's mother, and in that moment, Abigail realized that this fierce, proud warrior, this man who had saved her, this man she had feared, was also a son, a man with a family, a home, a life that was as rich and complex as her own. Over the next few days, Abigail began to see a different side of Nokona. She saw him with his son, a small, bright-eyed boy who adored him. She saw him with his people, a respected leader, a man of wisdom and authority. She saw the gentleness beneath the warrior's stoic exterior, the kindness behind the impassive mask. She was given her own teepee, and the women of the tribe, though still wary of her, brought her food and warm blankets. They showed her how to prepare the hides of the animals Nokona hunted, how to find the edible roots and berries that grew in the canyon. She began to learn their language, her tongue clumsy with the unfamiliar sounds, and she began to understand. She began to see the world through their eyes, to understand their deep connection to the land, their fierce pride in their heritage, their profound sense of loss at the encroachment of her own people. One evening, as she sat by the fire in her teepee, her sons sleeping peacefully, Nokona entered. He sat across from her, his face serious. "My people are afraid," he said. "They see you, and they see the soldiers who hunt us, the settlers who steal our land. They do not understand why I brought you here." "I understand," Abigail said, her voice quiet. "I am grateful for what you have done for me, but I cannot stay here. I do not belong here." "Where will you go?" he asked. "You have nothing. No home, no family." "I will find a way," she said, though she had no idea how. "I am a survivor." "Yes," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "You are." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the fire, and then he said something that changed everything. "I have a wife," he said, his voice low. "Her name is Tashina. She was taken by the soldiers 2 winters ago. They attacked our camp at dawn. They killed many of our women and children. They took Tashina and the other young women captive." Abigail stared at him, her heart aching with a pain that was not her own. She had thought him a widower like herself. She had assumed the old woman was his mother and the boy his son. "I have been searching for her ever since." He continued, his voice thick with a grief he could no longer hide. "I follow every rumor, every lead. I have been to the forts, the settlements. I have offered to trade for her, but they will not give her back." "The boy," Abigail began, her voice a whisper. "He is my nephew," Nokona said. "My sister was killed in the raid. I have raised him as my own." The twist was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, dawning realization, a series of revelations that shattered Abigail's preconceived notions and turned her world upside down. The Comanche warrior was not a savage. He was a grieving husband, a surrogate father, a man driven by a love as fierce and unwavering as her own. And she, the widowed settler, the victim of a cruel fate, was a member of the people who had inflicted this pain upon him, who had stolen his wife, who were destroying his way of life. The line between good and evil, between victim and perpetrator, was not as clear as she had once believed. The world was not black and white. It was a complex tapestry of shades of grey, of joy and sorrow, of love and loss, of kindness and cruelty. And in the heart of the Comanche camp, in the midst of a people she had been taught to fear, Abigail began to find a new sense of purpose, a new understanding of herself and her place in the world. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a witness, a bridge between 2 worlds. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that her journey was far from over. Her path was now intertwined with Nokona's, and together they would face whatever the future held, their shared grief and their unlikely bond, forging a new unexpected destiny in the heart of the Wild West. The winter that held the Palo Duro Canyon in its icy grip became a season of profound metamorphosis for Abigail. The raw, primal fear that had once defined her existence thawed as slowly and surely as the frozen river under the strengthening sun. Life in the Comanche camp was a rhythm, ancient and steady, and she found herself gradually, hesitantly falling into its cadence. It was a life dictated not by the hands of a clock, but by the rising of the sun, the needs of the children, and the success of the hunt. The initial hostility from the other women, a wall of suspicion and resentment, did not crumble overnight. It eroded, worn away by the quiet dignity with which Abigail carried herself. They watched her, their dark eyes missing nothing. They saw the fierce, unwavering devotion she had for Caleb and Joshua. They saw her hands, raw and blistered, at first learn the painstaking work of scraping a hide. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to master the intricate patterns of their beadwork. They heard her stumbling attempts to speak their language, her tongue twisting around the unfamiliar syllables, and though they sometimes laughed, it was a gentle laughter, no longer edged with malice. Nokona's mother Ada became the primary bridge between Abigail's world and theirs. Ada, whose face was a beautiful, intricate map of a long and difficult life, saw past the color of Abigail's skin to the shared heart of a mother. She would arrive at Abigail's teepee each morning, a silent, commanding presence, and wordlessly begin a lesson. She taught Abigail which roots dug from the thawing earth were sweet and nourishing, and which would bring only stomach cramps. She showed her how to use a bone awl to stitch moccasins, her gnarled fingers guiding Abigail's clumsy ones with surprising patience. Often Ada would simply take one of the twins holding Caleb or Joshua against her chest and humming ancient, wordless lullabies that seemed to resonate with the very soul of the canyon. In these moments, Abigail saw a future she could never have imagined. Her sons, born of a settler's dream, were being rocked in the arms of a Comanche matriarch, their first sounds of comfort, the songs of a people her own kind sought to eradicate. The irony was a constant bittersweet ache in her chest. Her conversations with Nokona deepened, evolving from a simple exchange of necessary information into a true meeting of minds and hearts. The nightly fire in her teepee became a sanctuary, a place where the barriers between them seemed to dissolve in the flickering orange light. He would speak of his grief for Tashina, not as a sudden outburst, but as a slow, steady current of sorrow that ran beneath the surface of his life. He described her laughter, the way she could quiet a fussy child with a touch, her skill in finding medicinal herbs. In sharing his memories, he was not just mourning his wife, he was keeping her alive. Abigail, in turn, found herself opening up in ways she never had before, not even with Jedediah. She spoke of the stifling expectations of her life back east, of a world that felt both crowded and lonely. She confessed her own fears, not just of the wilderness, but of the emptiness that had yawned before her after her husband's death. They discovered a common ground in their shared losses, a mutual respect for the resilience each had been forced to find within themselves. He saw her not as a helpless victim, but as a woman of quiet, unyielding strength. She saw him not as a savage warrior, but as a man of profound honor and deep, abiding love. The news, when it came, shattered the peaceful rhythm of the camp like a thrown stone. A scout, gaunt and weary from a long ride, reported seeing a column of soldiers moving north, a sad, bedraggled train of Comanche women, captives in their wake. They were, he said, being taken to the American fort at Sill in the dreaded Indian Territory. A single name hung in the air unspoken, but felt by everyone Tashina. Hope, fierce and dangerous, ignited in Nokona's eyes. It was a desperate, painful light in the darkness of his long grief. "I must go," he told Abigail that evening, his voice tight with an emotion he rarely showed. "I must see." The thought of his absence struck Abigail with a force that surprised her. The camp, once a place of terror, had become her sanctuary. Nokona, her captor, had become her protector, her confidant, her friend. To be left behind felt like being abandoned all over again. "I will come with you," she said the words leaving her lips before she had fully processed the thought. Nokona stared at her, his usual impassivity broken by a look of profound surprise. "The journey is not like before," he cautioned, his voice low. "We travel into the white man's world. To see a Comanche warrior with a white woman and her children, it will bring questions. It will bring danger." "My place is not here," Abigail countered, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know it possessed. "Not truly. And your fight is now my own. You saved my sons. You saved me from more than just the blizzard. You saved me from despair. I will not let you ride into that danger alone." He studied her face for a long moment, his obsidian eyes searching hers. He saw no fear, only a resolute determination that mirrored his own. He gave a single sharp nod. "Then we will ride at dawn." Their second journey together was a stark contrast to the first. Abigail, no longer a weak and frightened refugee, was a capable partner. She rode a gentle mare, her son secure on her back, in a leather carrier lined with soft rabbit fur. She knew how to make camp, how to find kindling, how to read the subtle signs of the weather in the clouds. They moved across the plains, not as captor and captive, but as equals, a silent, powerful understanding flowing between them. The approach to Fort Sill filled Abigail with a cold dread. The fort was an ugly scar on the landscape, a place of sharp angles and rigid authority. The stars and stripes flapped in the wind, a symbol that had once meant safety to her, but now felt like a threat. The soldiers they passed stared openly, their eyes lingering on her, with a mixture of suspicion and lewd curiosity, then shifting to Nokona with undisguised hatred. They found the captive women in a crude stockade near the stables. The stench of fear and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the air. The women huddled together, their faces masks of numb despair, their vibrant traditional clothing dirty and torn. They were flowers ripped from the earth, wilting in the cruel, indifferent sun. Nokona's search was a frantic, desperate act. He moved along the fence, his gaze sweeping across the faces, his breath held tight in his chest. Abigail's own heart hammered against her ribs, sharing in his agonizing suspense, and then he froze. "Tashina." He breathed the name a prayer. Abigail followed his gaze. She saw a woman sitting apart from the others, her frame thin, her hair matted her eyes, holding a deep, haunted emptiness. As Nokona called her name again, louder this time, the woman's head lifted. The emptiness in her eyes flickered, then was consumed by a dawning light of disbelief, of impossible, miraculous recognition. A smile slow and radiant spread across her face, a sunrise after a long, dark night. It was the most beautiful thing Abigail had ever seen. Their reunion was brutally cut short. A burly sergeant with a face like cured leather and cold, merciless eyes blocked Nokona's path. "That's far enough, Comanche." He snarled his hand, resting menacingly on the butt of his pistol. Behind him, other soldiers swaggered forward, eager for a confrontation. "These women are federal property. Turn around and ride out before you get yourself killed." A low growl rumbled in Nokona's chest. The calm, stoic man Abigail knew vanished, replaced by a warrior pushed to the brink. His muscles coiled, his hand tightened on the hilt of his knife, and Abigail knew he was about to launch himself at the soldiers, a glorious, futile act of defiance that would end only in his death. Acting on pure instinct, she stepped between them, placing a firm hand on Nokona's tense forearm. "No," she said, her voice low but commanding. "Let me." She turned to face the sergeant, pulling herself up to her full height, her gaze direct and unflinching. She felt no fear, only a righteous, burning anger. "Sergeant," she began, her voice ringing with a clarity that made the soldiers pause. "My name is Abigail Clay. My husband and I settled a claim on the Salt Fork of the Red River. He died of a fever this winter, just before the great blizzard hit." She let the silence hang for a moment, drawing the eyes of every man. "I was alone with my newborn twin sons. No food, no firewood. We were dying." She looked directly at the sergeant. "This man Nokona found us. He could have left us to freeze. He could have killed us. Instead, he hunted for me. He brought me wood. He saved my children's lives. His people took us in, shared their homes and their food, and asked for nothing in return." She took a step closer, her voice dropping, but losing none of its intensity. "That woman," she said, her arm rising to point directly at Tashina, who was now on her feet. Her eyes wide, "is his wife. She was stolen from her home, from her husband, from her family. You call her property. I call her a wife and a daughter. She is a human being, sergeant with a heart and a soul and a right to be free. I have seen the savagery of the Comanche people, and it is a kindness and a decency you and your men could learn from. Now you will let her go." A stunned silence fell over the yard. The sergeant, accustomed to threats and violence, was utterly disarmed by her words, by the sheer force of her conviction. He looked from Abigail's blazing eyes to the two healthy babies on her back, living proof of her story. He looked at Nokona, whose rage had subsided, replaced by a look of stunned awe. Finally, his gaze settled on Tashina, who was now weeping silently, her hand outstretched through the fence. The sergeant was a hard man, a product of a hard service. But he was somewhere beneath the uniform and the years of conflict, a man. He had a wife in a small town in Ohio he hadn't seen in 2 years. He cleared his throat, his face flushing under his tan. "Official regulations are clear," he said, his voice a low grumble. He couldn't meet her eyes. "I can't just release a federal captive." He paused, then spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "However, security can get lax after dark. We're short-handed. A determined prisoner might find a loose board in the fence behind the stockade. If such an escape were to happen, my men and I would likely be too occupied with our card game to notice for a good long while." He finally looked at Nokona. "I'd suggest you be far from here by sunrise." That night, as a sliver of moon rose over the fort, Tashina slipped through a conveniently loosened board and into the arms of her husband. Their reunion was not a passionate explosion, but a quiet, sacred coming together, a mending of two souls that had been violently torn apart. They held each other weeping without sound, their tears washing away years of pain and solitude. The journey back was filled with a light and a joy that seemed to make the prairie itself bloom. Tashina, though physically frail, possessed an inner strength that matched Nokona's. She and Abigail forged an immediate and powerful bond, communicating through a mixture of broken English Comanche words and the universal language of shared womanhood. The welcome at the camp was a joyous explosion of life. Tashina was swept up in a tide of embraces and tears, her return a symbol of hope for all of them. A great feast was held. The sounds of drumming and singing echoing through the Palo Duro Canyon late into the night. In the midst of the celebration, Abigail felt a familiar pang of otherness. She was happy for them, a deep, genuine happiness. But this was their joy, their home. Her journey with them was at an end. A few days later, her opportunity arrived, with a small caravan of traders heading east toward the dusty settlement of Tascosa. The farewells were laden with an emotion that caught Abigail by surprise. Ada held her face in her weathered hands, her dark eyes shining with tears as she kissed Abigail's cheeks, then the foreheads of each of the twins. The final goodbye was with Nokona and Tashina. They stood before her not as a warrior and his wife, but as two friends. Tashina pressed a beautifully beaded pouch into Abigail's hand. "For your journey," she said, "so you do not forget us." Nokona placed his hand over his heart, then on Abigail's shoulder. "Shaman," he said, using the Comanche word for a person of spiritual power and wisdom, a title of ultimate respect. "You have a great heart. You walk in two worlds. May the Great Spirit always light your path." Tears streamed down Abigail's face. "And yours," she whispered, her voice thick. "I will tell my sons of the great warrior who saved them." As the trader's wagon rattled away from the canyon, Abigail looked back. She saw Nokona and Tashina hand in hand watching her go. She saw the teepees, the smoke rising into the clear blue sky, the vibrant life of the camp. It was a world she had entered as a terrified captive and was now leaving as family. She carried her sons' the future in her arms, and the lessons of the past months, a treasure of far greater worth than the gold the settlers sought in her heart. The Wild West had taken everything from her, and then in the most unexpected of ways, it had given her everything back. She was no longer widowed and abandoned. She was Abigail Clay, and she was, for the first time in her life, truly free. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Old West. The story of Abigail and Nokona is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the harshest of circumstances, compassion and courage can bridge the widest of divides. It's a story that proves that family isn't always about blood, but about the bonds we forge in the fires of adversity. If their story of survival, unlikely friendship, and unexpected twists moved you, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the wild and untamed West. Your support helps us to keep these stories alive. Until next time, travel safely.